January of 2010, a Gulf Cartel lieutenant tortured and killed one of Miguel Trevino Morales' closest men. The message he sent back was short: hand over the assassin. If you don't comply, there will be war. The Gulf Cartel ignored it. Within weeks, the most catastrophic split in Mexican organized crime history exploded across the entire northeast of the country, and the body count that followed would shock the world. 72 migrants executed in a single afternoon. A casino full of 52 people burned alive. Entire towns erased from the map. And at the center of it all was a betrayal that had been building for over a decade between two organizations that were never supposed to exist without each other. Here's what nobody tells you about this war. The Gulf Cartel didn't just lose their enforcers when Los Zetas broke away. They lost the men they had trained, armed, and built into the most militarized criminal force Mexico had ever seen. Men who knew every plaza, every contact, every safe house, every government official on the payroll. When Los Zetas turned around and pointed all of that knowledge back at the Gulf Cartel, it wasn't just a turf war, it was a complete dismantling. And by the time it was over, the Gulf Cartel had fractured into 4 different factions, fighting each other in the same cities they used to run together. But here's the part that really gets me. The man who started all of this, the man who recruited those soldiers, who handed them weapons, who turned them into the most feared killing machine in the Western Hemisphere, was a guy who got his own position by killing his best friend. His name was Ociel Cardenas Guillen, and his nickname tells you everything you need to know. They called him El Mata Amigos, the friend killer. The story of the Gulf Cartel versus Los Zetas is really the story of a man who built his empire on betrayal and then got buried by the same thing he started. Stay right here, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how 31 military deserters became the most powerful criminal organization in Mexican history. What really triggered the split that nobody in the Gulf Cartel saw coming, and why everything that happened afterward was basically inevitable from the moment Ociel pulled that first trigger. Let's go back to 1996. The Gulf Cartel at that time was one of the oldest criminal organizations in Mexico, running drug corridors out of Tamaulipas state in the northeast, right along the Texas border. The operation had been built by a man named Juan Garcia Abrego, who turned the Gulf Cartel into a cocaine trafficking powerhouse by locking in deals with the Colombian cartels. Garcia Abrego had government protection. He had military connections. He had money moving in volumes that most people couldn't fathom. And then, the Mexican government arrested him and handed him straight to the United States. Just like that, the throne was empty. What followed was the kind of power struggle you only see when there's no clear air. Multiple lieutenants started making moves. Garcia Abrego's own brother tried to take over and failed completely. A couple of other bosses stepped up and got arrested within months. The whole organization was hemorrhaging, and into that vacuum stepped 2 men who had been grinding their way up from the bottom together. Ociel Cardenas Guillen and his partner Salvador Gomez Herrera, known as El Chava. These two were close, real close. They had built their networks together in the chaos after Garcia Abrego's fall, and by the late 90s, they had effectively seized joint control of the Gulf Cartel as co-leaders. Here's where the first betrayal happens. In the summer of 1999, El Chava was gunned down. And it wasn't a rival who ordered the hit. It was Ociel, his own partner, his close friend, the man he had come up with through years of danger and violence. Ociel had him killed to remove the last obstacle standing between himself and total control of the Gulf Cartel. After the killing, journalists started reporting on it, and the name stuck permanently: El Mata Amigos, the friend killer. Ociel reportedly hated that nickname. He didn't let it slow him down for a single day. Now think about the blueprint that just got established. This is the foundation everything else is built on. The man now running the Gulf Cartel got there by eliminating the person who trusted him most. And the thing about that pattern is, it doesn't stay contained. It teaches the people around you exactly what loyalty is worth when ambition gets involved. Now OCL is sitting on the throne of the Gulf Cartel, but he's got a serious problem. The Sinaloa cartel under El Chapo and El Mayo Zambada is growing fast, and they have their eyes on Tamaulipas. The key city is Nuevo Laredo, which sits directly across the Rio Grande from Laredo, Texas. Over 40% of all cargo truck crossings from Mexico into the United States pass through that one checkpoint. Whoever controls Nuevo Laredo controls the most valuable drug corridor in North America. OCL understood that he needed something more than regular cartel gunmen to hold that city. He needed something different, something that would make his rivals think twice before they ever moved on his territory. So in 1997, OCL made a decision that would alter the trajectory of organized crime in Mexico forever. He started recruiting from the Mexican military, not regular soldiers, elite soldiers, members of the Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, known as the GAFES, which was Mexico's equivalent of special forces. Men who had been trained in counterinsurgency tactics, advanced weapon systems, intelligence gathering, and interrogation methods. Men who had reportedly received additional training from both the Israeli Defense Forces and the United States Army. Men who knew exactly how to wage a modern war. The first leader of this new unit was a lieutenant named Arturo Guzmán de Sena, radio code designation Z1. He and a fellow GAFE soldier named Heriberto Lascano, designated Z3, were able to convince 34 of their brothers to desert their posts and join the Gulf Cartel's security arm. The first 14 who came over became known internally as the Group of 14. They were called Los Zetas, named after the Z radio codes used by federal judicial police commanders in Mexico. Lascano himself had joined the Mexican army at 16, made it to GAFE, and according to multiple accounts had received direct military training from Israeli and American forces before OCL pulled him away from all of that. His torture methods were so extreme that his own organization gave him the nickname El Verdugo, the executioner. He was reportedly known for feeding enemies to lions and tigers he kept on a private ranch. Now think about what Agil had just built. He had taken men who were trained by special forces programs backed by the United States and Israel, handed them cartel resources, cartel money, and cartel freedom, and turned them loose on his rivals. These weren't gangsters who learned to shoot in the street. These were trained soldiers who could set up surveillance networks, execute coordinated ambushes, run counterintelligence operations, and carry out missions with military precision. The Gulf Cartel went from a drug trafficking organization with hired muscle to something that looked more like a private army with a drug trafficking operation on the side. And it worked. When the Sinaloa cartel tried to move into Nuevo Laredo in the early 2000s, Los Zetas met them with the kind of response they had never faced before. In the first 8 months of 2005 alone, an estimated 110 people died in Nuevo Laredo. The Sinaloa cartel created their own enforcer group, Los Negros, to compete. They never came close to matching the Zetas. By the time the dust settled, Nuevo Laredo was still Gulf Cartel territory, protected by the most effective killing force in Mexico. But here's where it gets crazy. The more Los Zetas fought, the more they grew. The more they grew, the more autonomous they became. They weren't just security anymore. They were running their own extortion operations, their own kidnapping rackets, their own protection schemes in every territory they touched. They were expanding beyond what their original mandate called for, and OCL from the throne either couldn't see what was happening or chose not to address it. That decision would cost the entire Gulf Cartel everything. In March of 2003, it all caught up with OCL. Mexican military forces had been tracking him for months through a secret operation authorized directly by President Vicente Fox. On March 14th, they moved in on him in Matamoros, following a gunfight between soldiers and Gulf Cartel gunmen protecting their boss. OCL was captured. He was on the FBI's most wanted list with a $2 million bounty on his head. He was sent to the high-security federal prison known as La Palma and eventually extradited to the United States in January of 2007, where he was later sentenced to 25 years. When OCL went down, the organization he had built faced its first real test. And what happened next revealed just how much the power balance had already shifted. Heriberto Lascano, Z3, stepped into the vacuum and effectively took control of both Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel simultaneously. He started assigning territory to his lieutenants like he ran the whole operation, because at that point, he basically did. Miguel Trevino Morales, who would later become known as Z40, got Nuevo León. El Cos, Jorge Eduardo Costilla Sanchez, got Matamoros. Others got Nuevo Laredo, Reynosa, and coastal territories stretching down through Veracruz. The Gulf Cartel's bosses were still there on paper, but Lascano was reorganizing the board. This is important because what you're watching is the original sin of this whole situation playing out in real time. A criminal organization that was designed to serve the Gulf Cartel is now effectively running it. And nobody, not the Gulf Cartel bosses, not the remaining Cardenas family members, not the street-level operators across Tamaulipas, had the power to stop it. By 2007, when OCL was formally extradited, Los Zetas had become something the original Gulf Cartel founders would never have recognized. They had expanded into Guatemala, seizing drug trafficking corridors with their trademark violence. They had built international supply chains, stretching through Central America to Colombia, Venezuela, Europe, and West Africa. They controlled more physical territory than any other cartel in Mexico, eventually overtaking even the Sinaloa cartel at their peak. Their membership had exploded from 34 military deserters to an organization that some estimates placed in the thousands. They were pulling in more money, commanding more territory, and operating more efficiently than the organization they technically still worked for. And the Gulf Cartel's remaining bosses could see all of it. They knew what was happening. So they started making moves to pull Los Zetas back under control. They tried to curtail operations. They tried to reassert the hierarchy that said the Gulf Cartel was in charge. They put out narco banners in Matamoros and Reynosa, accusing Los Zetas of going beyond their mandate, of running kidnappings and extortion and indiscriminate violence that was making the Gulf Cartel look bad. They tried to frame it like Los Zetas had gone rogue. Los Zetas did not let that narrative breathe for a single day. They put out their own banners immediately, and the counter message was direct. We carried out those executions and kidnappings under your orders. That is what we were created to do. You built this machine. You don't get to pretend now that you didn't. The public narco banner war playing out across Tamaulipas was basically both sides screaming their version of events at each other across the whole country. There was another layer underneath all of this that made the rupture even more unavoidable. The question of who was going to lead the Gulf Cartel going forward had no clean answer. OCL's brother Antonio Cardenas Guillen, known as Tony Tormenta, was one candidate. El Cos was another. But multiple sources reported that Tony Tormenta had developed serious problems with gambling, drugs, and erratic behavior that made him an unstable option for leading a major criminal organization. Los Zetas looked at this man who was supposed to be their boss, saw someone they considered a threat to the whole operation, and wanted no part of following his lead. Lascano was right there, had been running things since 2003 and had a functioning command structure. Why would they submit to a compromised figurehead? And there was the alliance question. The Gulf Cartel was making quiet moves toward a peace deal with the Sinaloa Cartel. The same Sinaloa Cartel that Los Zetas had spent years bleeding to keep out of Tamaulipas. That was deeply personal to men who had watched their brothers die on the front lines of that war. At the same time, Lascano had already been building his own independent relationships, forging alliances with the Beltran-Leyva brothers and the Juarez Cartel. Two completely incompatible visions for the future of the organization, and no neutral ground between them. All of this was the pressure building. The actual spark was something much more specific. Samuel Flores Borrego was a Gulf Cartel lieutenant operating in Reynosa. Sergio Peña Mendoza was a Zetas lieutenant covering the same corridor, radio code El Concorde 3. Technically, both men were on the same side, protecting the same drug routes in the same city. But there was a dispute over control of that specific territory. Over money, over who had the final authority. Flores Borrego made a unilateral decision. He had El Concorde 3 killed. That was the moment everything became irreversible. Killing a Zetas lieutenant in a disputed zone was not just a power move. It was a direct insult to the entire command structure of Los Zetas. Miguel Trevino Morales, Z40, sent the Gulf Cartel a single demand: hand over the man who killed my lieutenant. The Gulf Cartel looked at that demand and went silent. They ignored it completely. So in January of 2010, Trevino Morales escalated. One of his close associates was tortured and killed, and the ultimatum came back one final time. Hand over the assassin of my friend. If you don't comply, there will be war. The Gulf Cartel did not respond. That was the last diplomatic exchange. From that point forward, there was only war. What broke out across northeastern Mexico starting in the spring of 2010 was unlike anything the country had experienced before. Here's what made it different from every other cartel conflict Mexico had seen. Both sides were made up of soldiers trained in the same tactics, armed with the same weaponry, with shared intelligence about the same territory. This was not a cartel fighting a street gang. This was a military conflict between two paramilitary organizations fighting inside civilian cities. And the civilians caught between them paid a price that is almost impossible to process. The Gulf Cartel knew immediately they couldn't match Los Zetas on their own. Their former enforcers were better organized, better trained, and now better funded. So El Cos and the Gulf Cartel leadership made the most desperate move available to them. They reached out to the Sinaloa Cartel and offered a truce. Not just a truce, an active military alliance. Former rivals, men that Los Zetas had spent years fighting on behalf of the Gulf Cartel, were now being invited into Tamaulipas as partners. La Familia Michoacana joined the same coalition. The message to Los Zetas was clear. You are going to be surrounded on every side. Los Zetas answered by building their own coalition. They locked in the Juarez Cartel, the Beltran-Leyva organization, and the Tijuana Cartel. Every major criminal organization in Mexico was now aligned on one side or the other. The entire country had effectively been divided into two camps, all because of what started as a territorial dispute in Reynosa between two men who were supposed to be working together. The violence that followed produced a series of atrocities that drew international attention and forced the Mexican government into the most aggressive military response it had ever mounted against an organized crime group. The most devastating single event happened on August 24, 2010. 72 migrants from Central and South America were traveling through Tamaulipas, trying to reach the United States border. A Zetas convoy intercepted them in San Fernando. The migrants were taken off their buses, brought to a ranch, and executed against a wall. 72 people. The only survivor was a man who played dead, dragged himself miles across the Mexican countryside until he reached a military checkpoint and told soldiers what had happened. When forces arrived at the ranch, they found the bodies stacked against the wall, exactly as described. The massacre was not random. Los Zetas had developed a systematic practice of stopping migrants and forcing them to make a choice: join the organization as a soldier or die. These 72 had refused. The organization that OCL Cardenas built to protect drug corridors had evolved into something that executed 72 civilians who simply didn't want to become cartel soldiers. Less than 2 years later, at the same location in San Fernando, Los Zetas carried out a second massacre. This one killed 193 people over the course of 2 months. Buses were hijacked. People were taken to a ranch. Survivors were forced to fight each other to the death with sledgehammers. The winners were forcibly recruited. The bodies of the dead were buried in mass graves that Mexican authorities would spend years excavating. The war also moved into civilian infrastructure in ways Mexico had never seen. In August of 2011, Zetas members walked into the Casino Royale in Monterrey, one of Mexico's largest cities, doused the floor with gasoline, and set the building on fire while customers were still inside. 52 people burned to death. The attack was retaliation against the casino owner for not paying protection money. It was a message. Nobody is outside our reach. Not your business, not your employees, not your customers. Prison facilities became active battlefields. In January of 2012, Zetas inside the Altamira prison launched a coordinated attack on Gulf Cartel inmates, killing 31. 1 month later at Apodaca prison in Nuevo León, another organized assault killed 44 Gulf Cartel inmates while 37 Zetas simultaneously escaped in the confusion. These were not riots. These were planned military operations executed inside federal facilities. The Mexican government responded with the Kingpin strategy, targeting the highest-ranking leaders of both organizations. On November 5, 2010, the Mexican Navy ran a 6-hour operation in Matamoros that ended with the death of Tony Tormenta, Antonio Cardenas Guillen, OCL's own brother. El Cos was arrested in September of 2012, captured without a single shot fired in a residential neighborhood in Tampico. His arrest came days after the body count in Nuevo Laredo hit 63 killed in just 8 days during a single surge of fighting. Then came the end of an era. On October 7, 2012, Mexican Navy personnel responded to a civilian complaint about suspicious armed men near a baseball stadium in Progreso, Coahuila. They tried to stop a vehicle. The men inside opened fire with guns and grenades. In the firefight, the driver was killed, 1 man escaped, and a third was shot dead fleeing on foot. When the body was later identified, it was confirmed as Heriberto Lascano, Z3, El Lasca, the co-founder of Los Zetas, dead at 37 years old in a routine patrol encounter in a northern Mexican state. In a final act that said everything about what this organization was, an armed Zetas convoy arrived at the funeral home in Sabinas, Coahuila, where the bodies had been taken. They walked in and stole Lascano's corpse. The Mexican government had already confirmed his identity through fingerprints, but his body was gone. He had operated as a ghost for his entire career. His own men made sure he stayed one. Miguel Trevino Morales took full command. But the fractures were already irreparable. The tension between Trevino Morales and Lascano in their final years had split the organization's loyalties. And after Lascano's death, those factions didn't dissolve. They kept existing and eventually turned on each other. In July of 2013, Trevino Morales himself was arrested in a vehicle near Nuevo Laredo. His brother Alejandro took over and was arrested in March of 2015. By 2025, the Northeast Cartel the most powerful surviving faction of what was once Los Zetas, had been formally designated a foreign terrorist organization by the United States State Department. The Gulf Cartel was in equally bad shape. With El Cos gone and Tony Tormenta dead, the organization that had once dominated all of northeastern Mexico had shattered into Los Metros, Los Rojos, Los Ciclones, Los Dragones, Grupo Escorpiones, and others. Each faction controlled pieces of the cities the Gulf Cartel used to run completely. They fought each other as often as they fought Los Zetas. In 2023 and 2024, Reynosa, the same city where El Concorde III was killed, and this whole war began, saw some of its worst violence in years as internal Gulf Cartel factions destroyed their own ceasefire agreements and went back to war on the same streets. The United States Department of State today lists Tamaulipas as a Level 4 Do Not Travel Advisory. The same classification given to active war zones and countries in open armed conflict. This is the state where the Gulf Cartel was founded, where Los Zetas were recruited, where the split exploded, where the war has never truly ended. What this story really comes down to is a pattern that repeats itself in organized crime, but rarely on this scale or with these consequences. Oziel Cardenas Guillen got to the top by killing the person closest to him. Then he spent years handing power, weapons, training, and territory to the men he trusted most, without ever building the kind of structure that could survive without him at the center of it. When he went down, everything he built was inherited by men who had become more powerful than the organization they were supposed to serve. And when the Gulf Cartel tried to claw that power back, it was already too late. Here's the final detail that ties this all together. OCL reportedly began cooperating with the United States government from behind bars around the same time the split was happening. The classified agreement he reached with U.S. prosecutors in 2010, the same year the war formally began, suggests that some of the intelligence feeding the government's operations against both organizations during the war years may have come from the man who built them both. The friend killer, who created the most destructive enforcer group in Mexican history, may have been one more layer in the betrayal that ultimately brought both sides down. Every person who died in that war traces back to a chain that started when one man decided his closest friend was more useful to him dead than alive. OCL built a machine that ran on betrayal, and in the end, the machine consumed everything he had ever built, including itself. The Gulf Cartel never recovered, Los Zetas never stabilized, and Tamaulipas, the state where all of it was centered, is still living in the damage today, more than 15 years after the split that was supposed to end in one side winning. Nobody won. That's the part nobody talks about. For real. Let me go back and give you the full picture on something that often gets glossed over in these stories because people focus on the violence and forget the scale. At the peak of Los Zetas' power in 2012, this organization had a documented presence in 11 Mexican states and had physically overtaken the Sinaloa cartel as the cartel with the largest territorial footprint in the entire country. Think about what that means. The Sinaloa cartel is often described as one of the most powerful criminal organizations in world history, with connections to every major drug market on the planet. Los Zetas surpassed them in territorial control. An organization that had existed for less than 15 years from its founding, built entirely by deserting soldiers who started with 34 men and a mandate to protect one man's drug corridors, had become the dominant criminal force in Mexico. And then the Gulf Cartel killed El Concorde III in Reynosa and refused to hand over the man responsible. That's the insane part. After all of that history, after watching Los Zetas become what they became, the Gulf Cartel's leadership still thought they could ignore an ultimatum. They either believed they still had enough leverage to contain the situation, or they had completely miscalculated how far the power balance had already shifted. Either way, they were wrong, in a way that cost tens of thousands of lives. There is also a dimension to this story that goes beyond just the cartel conflict. The split between the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas fundamentally changed the rules of organized crime in Mexico in ways that all the other cartels were forced to respond to. Before Los Zetas went independent, cartel violence was brutal, but it operated with a certain internal logic. Drug trafficking organizations fought over corridors. They killed rivals and government officials who threatened their business, but there was generally a calculation behind the violence. Los Zetas changed that calculation by introducing mass civilian casualties as a standard operational tactic. The San Fernando massacres, the casino attack, the prison assaults, the highway kidnappings, all of these established that no one and nothing was off limits. And other organizations watched and adapted. La Familia Michoacana, which had originally been a Gulf Cartel and Zetas affiliate, had already broken away in 2006, partly because of the extreme violence they witnessed from Los Zetas. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, which would go on to become one of the most powerful and violent organizations in Mexico by the late 2010s, cited the power vacuum left by the Zetas fragmentation as one of the factors that allowed their expansion into new territories. Every escalation in Mexican cartel violence in the decade following 2010 can be traced in some way back to the norms that the Gulf Zetas War established. The families of ordinary people living in Tamaulipas during these years gave account after account of towns where both sides were actively recruiting by force, where refusing a recruitment meant execution, where leaving the region was dangerous because checkpoints run by one side or the other meant that traveling in the wrong vehicle or with the wrong license plates could get you killed. Ciudad Mier, a small town in Tamaulipas near the Texas border, was essentially emptied of its civilian population in 2010 as both organizations fought through the streets. Residents fled to a neighboring city rather than stay in a town that had become a battlefield. It was reported at the time as a ghost town, occupied only by armed men. The journalists trying to cover all of this faced a different kind of threat. Both organizations used media intimidation as a standard operating procedure, and the Gulf Zetas War intensified what had already been a dangerous environment for Mexican reporters. Newspapers in Tamaulipas and Nuevo León stopped publishing stories about cartel violence, not because the violence stopped, but because the publications were receiving direct threats. Some stopped naming cartels in their reporting entirely. The silence that surrounded a lot of what happened in northeastern Mexico between 2010 and 2015 was not because there was nothing to report. It was because reporting it meant risking the reporter's life, their family, and their entire newsroom. What both of these organizations had in common, the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas both, was that they spent their final years as dominant forces in a cycle that no organization built on violence can ultimately escape. The more territory they seized, the more manpower they needed to hold it. The more manpower they brought in, the harder it became to maintain discipline and loyalty. The more pressure the government put on their leadership, the more those leadership structures fragmented and turned on themselves. The Gulf Cartel fractured into factions that fight each other. Los Zetas fractured into factions that fight each other. The state of Tamaulipas is now marked by a continuous, low-level war between the remnants of both organizations, plus new alliances that have brought in outside forces like the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Ociel Cardenas Guillen, the man who started all of this, is reportedly due for release from United States federal custody in the coming years after serving the majority of his 25-year sentence under a plea agreement. He has been cooperating with U.S. prosecutors for over a decade. The organization he built is gone. His brothers are dead or captured. The Cardenas family name that once commanded the entire Gulf of Mexico corridor is now just a detail in the historical record of how the whole thing collapsed. He will walk out of a federal facility and into a world where everything he built, every alliance he forged, every plaza he controlled, has been destroyed, fragmented, and handed to whoever was ruthless enough to hold it after the war. He made inevitable burned through everything. That is what happens when you build your throne on betrayal and hand weapons to the men you trust the most, without building the loyalty structures that would keep those weapons pointed in the right direction. The friend killer was always going to get killed by the same thing he used to get to the top. He just didn't know it would take the whole country with him when it happened.